Composition is the most talked about topic in photography. Maybe it's gear reviews, but recently I did a 7 daily vlog challenge of only using the Ricoh GR IIIx with the constraint of doing straight out of camera photography. So that means that there's no cropping, no editing, just purely focusing on compositions. So here are the 7 composition techniques that I've used during the 7-day challenge. And the first one is going to be following the light. Light in its own is not a composition technique. It's going to be an element that you need to consider whenever you're out taking the photo. So I'm going to give here 3 examples of different lighting and try to see the differences of each. Yeah, it's probably going to be a bit too small for you to see. So this image is going to be making use of backlight, silhouetting the man walking inside the tunnel. Backlighting is a great way to show a sense of place in the photo, and in this case being inside the tunnel. So it does preserve anonymity, and you tend to focus more on the shape and structure of this subject. That can evoke a bit of curiosity because everything is going to be in shadow apart from the very bright background. So this next image makes use of side light or partial light, where you partially cover a subject in shadow but revealing some of the parts in detail. And this ultimately helps separate the subject from the background. And this photo is going to be facing away from the light, and you can see that it does get rid of all the shadows and that there's actually no depth within the photo. You can see that the buildings from the back is sort of blending with the cranes and as well as the foreground building. So that is why this photo is more about the pop in color of the buildings and the dramatic clouds in the background rather than the depth and contrast of the photo. So as you can see from those examples, the way light interacts in your image can dramatically change the outcome and can introduce more depth and contrast in the image, drawing your viewers in. So the next time you shoot, try to compose with the available light in mind. You can also apply the similar concepts with artificial light, just like in night street photography. And here are going to be examples of backlight and side lighting profiles during the nighttime. So leading lines is just another compositional technique that makes use of natural or man-made occurring lines within the photo. And this is probably going to be the most used compositional technique for me because there's just lines everywhere. And just like in this example where I made use of the lines from the walkway as well as the repeated flags to draw your attention towards this lady. And you can also be a bit more creative, just like in this example where I created the lines myself by using a long exposure to create light trails. And this will show how busy the business district in Hong Kong is. And the light trails basically just leads your eye towards the tall skyscrapers of Hong Kong in the background. And just one more tip before we move on is to make sure that your leading line is actually pointing towards your subject. And it can appear to look like a mistake if there is no actual payoff in following that direction. Just like in this image where there's a prominent arrow on the road and it's pointing your eyes actually outwards of the frame because it's curving towards the right and then there's no subject that's going to be highlighted by following that line. Frame within the frame is the compositional technique of using available borders within your image to box your subject in or frame your subject in. And as I mentioned, your job as a photographer is to make sure that your composition helps in a way to emphasize or highlight your subject. And this is a great compositional technique to use because you're simply screaming out loud, hey, just look at this part of the image. Some obvious ways you can use this is to shoot through objects like doors, frames, windows, or any form of opening. And just like in this example where I made use of the railings to box the most iconic mountain peak in Hong Kong called Lion Rock, and while the highway at the bottom is sort of framing the iconic red taxi. And this one is going to be a good example because Hong Kong does have a lot of thrift stores that have very cramped space. And I basically just made the colorful toys to be my frame to box in the seller inside. And it doesn't always need to be doors or windows, and you can find these framings everywhere. So just like in this shot where I made use of the trees to surround the golden pavilion. And this works out better because there's color contrast between the pavilions and the muted greens of the trees. So as intellectual beings, hopefully, I think our brains are sort of wired to identify patterns as we see them. Adding them within your composition can give a sense of familiarity or stability within the image. Patterns can be as simple as identifying repetition or a color sequence. Just like in this example where I noticed the red umbrellas popped in unison, making it stand out during the lunch break. And it also helped that the harsh light around hid a lot of the details in shadow, further emphasizing this pattern. And in this example, I just noticed that the design of the advertisement is in sequence moving towards the right. So I basically just waited for the subject with the same color of shirt with the background to pass by the frame. And there could be a lot more examples that you can be creative in, for example in architecture photography or naturally occurring patterns that you see around, so it's always up to your creativity. One special case in finding patterns is to look for reflections, which can help distort the perspective of your viewer. And in the simplest case, you can find reflections to show some form of symmetry in the image, giving it more of a stable impression. So just look for things that have reflective surfaces, like the mirrored wall in this example, forming a symmetry with the sidewalk and road. And in this image, the water from the river will appear boring and empty without the reflection. But having this element totally changed the dynamic and helped me fill the frame with more interest. You can also consider using reflections to make some sort of double exposure, such as juxtaposing the reflection with the things on the opposite side of the reflective surface, which can lead to some very cool effects. So the next tip is going to be how you utilize the space within the frame and how you can do this effectively and with intention. But first, I need to define what is negative space, which is basically just empty space that surrounds your subject. The more negative space you have in your photo, the more it could appear like you're just wasting space, unless you want to evoke some form of drama, mystery, or sense of isolation within the photo. So just like in this image, there's a lot of negative space that surrounds the boat because it's just the empty waters, but it does have some dramatic light, so that's why I still took the photo. But personally, I did feel like the image was lacking. So that's why I took an alternative composition of adding the interesting wall where I was shooting the photo from to have a sense of layer within the frame. On the other hand, filling the frame is the opposite concept where you want to eliminate negative space. But you need to be a bit more cautious when using this because it can totally backfire when you add too many unrelated things within the frame. And just like my intrusive thoughts, stop filling it with nonsense. So in this example, I filled in the frame with my main subject that's being lit up and facing his opponent, and also the different bystanders watching the intense Chinese checkers action. So this bright part in the background is a bit distracting as it competes with your attention. So I could have improved the composition by either going in closer or changing my position to block that part off. Before we move on to the last tip, I do want to give you a bonus tip because you are special to me and you deserve more than what I promised you. And that is to combine the different techniques. So I think it's going to be quite a rare occurrence when I just go out to shoot with just one compositional technique in mind. So for example, in this first image that I showed you, there's going to be the backlight contrast as I mentioned, but it also makes use of the frame-to-frame technique when the man in shadow is going to be framed by the opening of the tunnel. And it also makes use of the leading line concept by having the edges of the tunnel lead your eye towards the exit of the tunnel. So in this second image, we have a strong side light profile and also makes use of the pattern of everyone else moving towards the left. And then the main subject of the photo is going to be the lady, is also going to be positioned in the rule of thirds. So in this next image, you have the repeated patterns of the pillars and also the color profile of the two gentlemen adds some color contrast within the frame. And they're neatly framed within their respective pillars as well. So combining multiple techniques just elevates the way your image looks. And the last tip is to not think of these techniques as rules to follow, and you can actually break them, just like when I explained it in this rule of thirds video that absolutely flopped. But yeah, basically just think of these techniques as different tools that you have in your photography toolkit that you can use whenever you deem it necessary. And know that composition can be quite subjective. You know, what is a good composition for me might not be a good composition for you. But one general rule of thumb that I try to follow in every photo that I take is to have a sense of visual balance within the image. And you can do this by dividing your photo into two parts and try to guesstimate which part is heavier than the other. So an unbalanced image may take their attention away from the narrative that you wanted to create. So if you found this video helpful, I think you'll also enjoy the different lessons that I've learned throughout the daily challenge. So why don't you click on this video and I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.